Henry hobbled over to his bed, his walking frame thudding on the carpeted floor. Dressed in his pajamas and dressing gown, these days he rarely wore anything else. He eased himself down onto his bed as gently as he could. Nevertheless, his knees cracked and his aching spine hunched. He was no more than a skeleton, but everything within him felt heavy and compacted. Wearisome life a daily challenge, he found the festive period especially challenging. He lived in a single room. Everything he needed was within the limited distance he could move around. His tiny kitchen with the old stove next to his sink, and a lounge area that doubled as his bedroom. He now spent his days resting on his bed, watching his television, or listening to his old transistor radio. Despite this, he still managed to put up his tiny Christmas tree in the far corner, and he watched the lights glow for a moment in the dark room. At the rear stood a glass door that led to a small garden, no more than a patch of grass surrounded by trees. It was accessible to him, and he often enjoyed sitting on the wooden chair where he fed the sparrows. On a branch hung a small bird feeder he kept topped up with peanuts, and in the centre of the lawn stood a stone bird bath. A simple pleasure remained in his life as he watched the tiny creatures as they flitted around. Christmas Eve arrived cold, with a gentle snowfall covering all with a layer of pure white. The bird bath stood with its frozen surface of ice. Henry liked to keep the curtain open to look past the end of his bed, through the glass door and into his garden beyond. Other than his daily carers who arrived each morning to feed him and help him around his room, he lived alone. He had done for almost a decade now. But each night, as he climbed into his bed, he took up the frame that sat on his nightstand and kissed his wedding photograph. The black and white image faded over time, had a worn spot just over the face of his wife, May, from where he kissed her each evening. She had loved the birds more than Henry. May sat for hours in their garden, standing before the canvas, easel in hand, and painted them. Even now, the small pictures lined his walls. Her favourite were the robins, and especially so at this time of year. There are orange and white breasts and dainty legs and beaks, childlike, in her eyes. Henry never got used to this loneliness. He missed her every hour of every day. She was never far from his thoughts. And as he kissed her photograph, he wished her a happy Christmas and placed the frame down gently. Next to the photograph lay a small glass of brandy that he indulged given the season, and he winced as he brought it to his lips and felt it burn as it slipped down. But the warming liquid made him feel a little better, and he flicked on his radio to listen to the choirs singing their hymns at midnight mass. He had to lift each leg onto the bed to settle down, but once he had, he pulled over his blanket and turned off the lamp. Listening to the sounds of singing, he also heard his own breath rattling in his lungs and his eyes getting heavy. The lights from his tree danced around the room, and he could see the snow piled high on top of the bird bath through the door. Eventually, his eyelids closed and he drifted off. He woke to the sound of tapping. Opening his eyes, he thought at first it came from this radio that he had left on. Static came through its speakers, and he clicked it off before settling back down again. The tapping continued. Using his pillow as a support, he sat up and rubbed his eyes. The tree lights still danced, but outside the moon shone brightly, illuminating the snowy garden so that the whole room glowed in a silvery light. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the door. Sitting up further, Henry perceived a tiny creature outside the glass. A robin. It flicked its head around, fixing Henry with a stare from the black dot of its eye. Smiling, Henry watched this curious bird for a moment. Soon enough, it began to tap its beak on the door once again. "What do you want, little robin?" asked Henry. The bird tapped again. "Are you hungry?" I might have some peanuts for you in here." As he spoke, he knew what an effort it would be for him to get up and make his way to the door. And yet something within him wanted to do this more than anything. A little Christmas gift for this nocturnal visitor. With an effort, he swung his legs from the bed, put his feet in his warm slippers, and reached for his walking frame. Using it, he stood, the blanket falling away from him, and he took a moment to catch a breath. Shortly after, he made his way towards the door. Near to the door, he opened a drawer where he kept the packet of peanuts for the birds, and he grabbed a handful. As he moved, he felt invigorated, and something else washed over him. Calmness, serenity. It travelled through him, and the heaviness that invaded his body seemed to vanish. He left the walking frame, but still needed to steady himself as he walked towards the door, using his hand on the furniture. The door handle felt cold to the touch, but the robin still stood on the patio beyond, looking at Henry with curiosity. Twisting the handle, he felt the cold night air on his face, and it was refreshing, as though the snow and ice cleaned the very atmosphere. The robin hopped backwards a couple of steps as the door opened, but as Henry came outside, it raised its wings and flew over to the bird bath. "Where are you going, little robin?" asked Henry. "I have a little snack for you for Christmas night." The robin bobbed its head at him from the bird bath, raising its wings and flitting them about but not flying away. Henry opened his hand, showing the peanuts to the robin. It looked at them for a moment, hesitating, as though unsure of his motives. Then, quick as a flash, it flew over and landed on his fingers. Henry felt his heart could explode as the tiny bird sat on his hand, head switching backwards and forwards, looking at him with bead-like eyes. Then he grabbed a nut in its beak and flew off towards the rear of the garden and into the trees. Henry laughed with delight. It had been a long time since he had laughed, but now he felt the simple joy of nature in his heart. A beautiful evening. He stood for a moment, looking at the trees where the robin flew. He could still see it, Peanut sitting in its beak, standing on a branch. Henry took a few steps into the garden, the snow sticking to his slippers, the strength returning to his invigorated limbs. Keeping sight of the bird, he moved past the bird bath towards the line of trees. Then, suddenly, the robin vanished into the undergrowth. Sighing, Henry wished the bird could have stayed longer, and he looked into the trees to see if he could spot it. Instead, he saw the silhouette of a figure. "Hello, who's that?" he asked, wondering why someone would be in his garden so late. No reply. Henry moved closer, resting his hand on the wooden trunk of the tree the robin just vacated. "Who's there?" he asked. The silhouette inside began to approach him. He watched as the figure materialized from the surrounding darkness, seeming to float rather than walk, becoming more distinct. Henry caught his breath. May appeared from the trees. No longer the old lady he had stayed with as she died, but young again. He recognized her long white dress made of lace. She had worn this on the night they'd met, Christmas Eve, at a dance. Henry backed away, afraid of what this meant, taking steps back into his garden, his feet sinking into the snow. She emerged from the trees, her face white but smiling. That beautiful smile. Oh, was all Henry could manage. She held out her hand to him, and without hesitation, he moved towards her and took it. When their hands met, he felt an energy surge through him. All his aches vanished, the strength returned to his bones, and the cold night became warm. The stars twinkled brightly, and the snow around shone in crystalline brilliance. Looking down at his own body, he saw he was dressed in a black suit, white shirt, and bow tie. The same he had worn that evening, all those years ago. the night he met May, at a dance on Christmas Eve. May held his hand down by his waist, and the other she placed on his shoulder as he drew her closer. Embracing, he placed his head next to hers, feeling the softness of her hair against his cheek. They began to dance. Around the garden they went, waltzing around the bird path, the gentle rise and fall of two souls entwined. All the cold vanished, all the pain of life extinguished, the pleasure of the dance total. Lifting up May's hand above her head, her smile broadened as she spun below, and he took her into hold once again as they continued. With foxtrot steps, they caroused in the snow, moving together as one, until the crescendo of the dance, as she pulled away from him momentarily before rushing back into his arms yet again. Rotating with small steps, they moved closer, and he kissed her as he did for the first time on a cold Christmas Eve. The dance ended, and she held his hand in hers. She fixed her gaze upon him and began to lead him back into the trees. He followed her without question and without remorse. They were together once again, and forever young. Christmas morning arrived clean and fresh, and the robin emerged from the trees. Flying over the bird path, it took up its spot once again outside the glass door. Peering inside, two people, a man and a woman, stood over the bed, wearing latex gloves and green scrubs. The woman looked at the man, sadness etched on her face, and shook her head. The man lifted the blanket and covered the body that lay in the bed. The robin tapped the door, and they both looked over. The woman approached the door and opened it, watching the robin as it flew back into the trees. Perching on a branch, it was joined by another, bobbing its head and flitting its wings. She smiled at them both.